Evening, everyone, and I'd like to welcome everyone to this regularly scheduled meeting of the Planning Commission for Tuesday, April 25th, 2023. I'm going to open the meeting at 7:30. Can we please stand for the Pledge of Allegiance? I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. May I have roll call, please?
Mr. Fitzer? Mr. Hara?
Ahoy.
Mr. Colbert?
Here.
Mr. Kucera?
Here.
Mr. Nushai? Ms. Redmond?
Here.
Mr. Scott?
Here.
Mr. Solomon?
Here.
Mr. Watson? Thank you.
Thank you. Agenda item number 4 is approval of this agenda. Does anyone have any changes or any?
I do have one change. Under agenda item 8, consideration of the draft capital improvement plan, I did actually abstain from that vote. It says I'm an aye, so if we could move me.
Oh, you're on the other one.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah, this is for, excuse me, this is for the agenda that's in front of us right now, for tonight's agenda.
Yeah, sorry about that.
Okay, so
Jumped ahead.
if everybody's happy with that, I can pass that. We don't have to vote on that. Then the next agenda item would be where you come in. It's approval of the regular meeting minutes from April 11th, 2023.
That's where I have an edit.
That was your edit?
Yes. You want me to restate that edit, or did you capture that, Nick?
Yeah, I think we need to have a motion first, and then we'll,
Okay.
yeah.
Well, you want to change a time on it or a comment on it? Is what you want?
Comment.
Okay.
So do I need to make a motion?
Yes, if that's what you want to do.
Yeah, I'd like to make a motion to edit agenda item 8, consideration of draft capital improvement plan. Currently, my name's listed under aye, and it should be under abstain based on how I voted.
For the minutes of April 11th?
Yep, April 11th.
We have to vote on that, on the fact that
Well,
you,
I think what you guys want to do is make a motion to approve the minutes, and then they're approved contingent on that change or anything else the board wishes. I think that's the proper protocol there.
Let's throw the changes in, and then we'll vote to approve. I have a minor change. Mine's very minor. It says that I opened the public comment at 8:45, and then it also says I opened the public comment at 9:17. It should say that I closed it at 9:17.
Got it.
It's simply a typo.
Okay.
So with those two things, we have a motion to approve.
Considering, yeah, those two changes included.
oh, yep, I'll make a motion to approve the agenda with the amended items.
Okay, no other changes? Roll call, please.
We do need a second, I believe.
We do.
Short.
We have a motion and support.
Okay. Who made the motion? I heard two motions, I just want to make sure.
I don't care, you can
Okay, who
have
wants-
that
Caption it
motion,
correctly.
Josh.
Okay,
Josh has the motion, I support it.
okay. All right. Mr. Harrell?
Yes.
Mr. Colbert?
Yes.
Mr. Kucera?
Yes.
Ms. Redmond?
Yes.
Mr. Scott?
Yes.
Mr. Solomon?
Yes.
All right, motion carries. Thank you, guys.
Thank you. Agenda item number 6 is public discussion. Anyone from the public wishes to speak about items that are not on the agenda. If anyone would like to say anything, please come to the microphone and give us your name, and we'll give you 3 minutes to say what you want to say.
For anything?
Anything that's not on the agenda.
Oh.
Hello.
Hello?
It's
and
not on the
address, sir.
agenda, but you said it's open for public for anything?
Yes, but if you give us your name and address, we'll...
John, I live on Tecumseh Street here
Okay.
in Clawson. My taxes are way too high, and that's what I would like to complain about. I don't expect much from you guys, but taxes are way too high. Outrageous. What else? Pizza Hut, empty. I know we don't own it. The Harp Store, there's a big empty field, empty. Puma Hug, closed. Lucky Duck, closed. And all my taxes. Are you the mayor?
No. I'm the chair of the planning commission.
That's what I thought. I'm not sure where the mayor is or the council. Are you guys the council members?
No.
All right.
This planning.
Wasn't sure about that at all. I didn't recognize you guys.
And we can't actually...
Planning. My my street by Barb's, you know,
Yeah, I know the country.
they've now made parking on the street. When are we gonna build out the curbs so I can fully pull up, look left and right? Because all I see is Bayless cars parked. I can't see. That has to be part of the plan sometime or another.
There within ordinances to park there during the
There
daytime
was a long
hours.
time ago, I remember it. I don't know whatever happened to it. I'm sure it will get done one day, but that's annoying. There's an empty building, that yellow, that car, that green car place, hideous. Fine them to death, to make them sell it.
I understand your points, and I tend to
Yeah.
agree with most of them. The problem is we cannot do that. So the properties you mentioned, these empty lots and properties, they're
Yeah.
held by
I understand
other
their
people.
own, it's America. If you don't want to sell it, it can be a green lot
Right.
to kingdom come.
Right.
But the street, our pavement, it's all blocked off, nasty. We have a lot of building going on, and it's very nice. We want to keep it that way and keep going. But my main point is my taxes are too high. That's all.
I
Thank you.
take that up with council. Thank you. Anyone else in public?
So I think I can speak about this, okay. So I actually live on 446 West 14 Mile Road, and I'm like the sore thumb of probably that entire street, actually. I'm the yellow house. I'm sure you guys have seen it. So it was brought to my attention that there potentially was plans to make apartments there. I think my point to that is that at least the landlord, the landlords, I mean, I was even promised to have those painted when I moved in, right? And I've been there for 14 months now. They do not fix things, and it's been a continued issue with all three of the houses that they own. So I could only imagine what would actually happen if that was the case, and they were to build apartments. Now, I wasn't a part of what that plan looks like, but I definitely wouldn't agree unless they're actually going to do something. I think it's also worth noting that I was informed today, not by them, that they were planning on building apartments. So I wasn't even aware of the fact that it was even potentially going to be a thing. So I wanted to bring that to your attention at least, because if we're going to continue to build in the city of Clawson, we should probably have people build that are going to do a good job at it.
That issue came in front of us at our last meeting. We postponed it. Obviously, they're not here tonight. I
Yeah.
think it's a possibility they'll be here 2 weeks from now
Okay,
to pitch the same thing.
all right,
Okay,
thank you.
thank you. Anyone else in public?
So Ryan Keeber, I live at West 468, 14 Mile. So is it just like when they show up is when you guys are discussing that, or how's it gonna work
Yeah.
for the development?
They applied for their site plan 2 weeks ago, and we discussed it all, and we postponed it. We want them to go away, come back with more details on what their proposal. There was a couple minor changes they had to do.
Okay, are those like public at all, as far as what the
Oh, yeah,
details are gonna
these
be of it,
meetings,
or?
these meetings are all public, yes.
No, I know that, but like the details of what they're planning to do.
The site plan
Yes.
would be on last meeting. You should be able to pull it. on-
You can go into the city page and you look at the planning commission, and you can look under our planning packets.
Planning
And
packets,
you
okay.
will see exactly the same thing that we're seeing up here, the same hard
Okay, I was
copy.
looking at like the post minutes and stuff, and I didn't see
Yeah.
anything, so that's what I was
Yeah,
wondering.
the minutes are on there, all the verbiage is on there, but you'll see all the drawings too, the elevations,
Okay,
plans, and everything else.
okay.
April 11th was the meeting, so if you look under
Yeah.
agenda meeting minutes and agendas and minutes, I think, and just go to planning packet and April 11th planning commission meeting, all of the
Okay.
detail that we've received is there.
Okay, and then as far as public input and stuff, like once I review those, just come back to the next meeting and.
Keep an eye
like,
out
is
on
there
the
a
minutes.
discussion,
Or so-
or-
keep an eye out for the agendas that are posted there at least a week in advance, I think. 4 or 5 days in advance. We don't even know when the next review would be, but when we know, it will be posted on the website as an agenda item.
Okay.
And all of the material that will be presented there will be shared in advance under that packet folder that you can look at.
Mm-hmm. Gotcha.
So-
So is it in the same place as the meeting minutes then? Like
Yeah.
around the logo? Okay. Sounds
So if you see it there and it's on that point, then that's your, I guess,
Yeah, I
notification
just wanted to
come.
review, like, because I mean, I live right next to it, on the property right next to it, and I have no idea what's going on, so I just wanted to see what the details of it were.
Well, and you can make public comment like today, like you are now as well, if it's not on the agenda, because Greg, you opened up public comment last time, but there's not always public comment.
Even if it's not on the
on
agenda, if the public from that neighborhood wants to come and talk about that project, yes, I will open it for public to
Okay,
see.
yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
I want to review the details of
Yeah,
it
you'll have a
first
say in
before I
the matter,
speak
yes,
about
for
it,
sure.
but,
For sure.
yeah,
And just
I
to
mean,
note, it is zoned for like a multifamily.
Yeah.
So, I don't mean to speak out of turn, guys, but just so everybody knows that, like, they do have a right to build that since it is zoned that. They were looking for variances, but hopefully that helps give you a little context to where, like, we can't outright say
Yeah.
no multifamily because it is zoned to multifamily, but, yeah, so.
Okay, yeah,
And-
it just get interesting, because I mean, that'd leave like essentially 2 houses on that entire street then at that point. I mean, everything else would be multifamily around it. But if
Yeah.
it's zoned for that, then, yeah.
Yeah, but we still would love to hear your comments, so.
Yeah, let me review the plan, I'll come back for the next meeting.
Yeah.
All right, thank you.
Thank you.
Do what? Gotcha. Okay.
I'm back. John from Tecumseh. I'm at our website right now. Where do I go?
City of Clausen, and then look up,
Building and planning?
I follow Documents on Demand,
There should be a link on
the homepage.
Our government first.
Nothing is ever clear, so I gotta go our government, agendas and minutes, not building and planning. Minutes on demand?
Yep.
Yeah, that gives you a listing of all the different commissions.
Scroll down to click here.
This?
It is difficult to see.
And then where?
Put it up on the big screen.
Can you pull up what they're gonna build?
They are changing their site plan from what was proposed last time, and so those plans aren't necessarily accurate. It'll give you an idea of what they're proposing, but not.
Alright. And that's where we'll find it in 2 weeks? Like
Whenever
their-
it's gonna be
Their
presented.
proposed plan?
But you can look at their past plan that they proposed last time.
I could, it's very arbitrary just to say go on Clausen, building in public, whatever, but,
Yeah, I know it's a bit of a pain to find it, but it's there.
yeah, it is a bit of a pain.
Nick, is it possible to
Email?
screen
Like,
share
can
in
we
any
get like a
capacity?
picture of it? I know it's gonna change.
Not, I mean, just to show them where it is, not to go through the details.
I don't think it'd be necessary, because we're not discussing it at tonight's meeting anyway, so.
Is there
Is there a paper copy of the agenda?
If you,
Pardon?
Be on the
they're on the.
back table?
Could be in the counter back there, yeah. Okay, thank you. Anybody else from public wishing to speak? Seeing none, I will then close public discussion. And we'll move on to agenda item number 7, which is training provided by Giffords and Webster, reviewing site plans. So, Mr. Tangera, I'm assuming that's why we have a crowd tonight, right?
Yeah, I'm sure. Here, I'm gonna share my screen here. All right, so Nick and I saw that we had a little hole in the schedule here, so we decided that we would, given that we have so many new members on the planning commission, we would take the opportunity to do a short training on development review, and this will be a kind of refresher for some of you, and then some of this information might be new if you're new to the planning commission. And if you're in the audience attending a compulsory evening meeting, it will probably all be new to you. So, development review is one of the primary tasks of the Planning Commission. It's one of the things that we do here. We look at plans for new development when they come in. But there are lots of different types of development review. So we have a bunch of things that are reviewed administratively. Those include signs, single-family homes, residential accessory buildings, fences, and minor site changes. And then we have site plans, special land uses, rezonings, and planned unit development, which all come here. And those are listed in kind of ascending order of discretion. So site plans are not very discretionary. If they meet standards, they have to be approved. Planned unit development is highly discretionary. It's essentially a negotiation between you and an applicant. So we'll get into some detail on all these. I grayed out the Zoning Board of Appeals variances and interpretations because we're not going to get into any detail on that tonight, but I did want to mention that that's another type of review that will come through the city. And I do have actually a Zoning Board of Appeals training that I could always do for the Planning Commission if we have another gap in our agenda, just so that you can all kind of get a sense of what the ZBA does.
Nice.
All right. Haven't heard that one in a while. All right. So when we think about development review, we have some goals that we're trying to achieve with all of the development review that we do. One is that we're promoting the goals of the master plan. Two is that we're securing compliance with our ordinances, and the ordinances should be based on the master plan, so those two things should go together. And then we're also looking to create predictability in the process. We're neither putting roadblocks in the place of development, nor are we pushing development. We're doing something much more neutral than that. We're trying to make sure that we're staying in line with our goals and keeping things compliant with our ordinances. So before we get into the different types of development review, there are a few different types of plan. So there are sketch plans, which are highly conceptual. There are plot plans, which are kind of refine a concept plan and make it to scale. We have site plans, which are detailed plans for developments, and then we have a type of site plan called a plat or a site condo, and that's a detailed land subdivision plan. Now, this is Clawson. We don't do subdivisions here because we don't have any land for subdivisions. We may, when one of the schools sells, have some sort of site condo process that we go through to allow some residential development there. So it's not out of the question, but it's extremely rare in the last 30 years for Clawson to be looking at a subdivision plan. So a sketch plan might look like the example on the left, where it's just sort of, back of the napkin stuff, where we're talking about, okay, this is kind of roughly what we want to do. And when you refine that to a plot plan, it gets a lot more formal, and you start to actually look at the real spatial relationships between things. And then on a site plan, you're going to fill in some of the detail. Things are going to be dimensioned. You're going to show how big everything is, how far apart it is. All the driveways, ultimately landscaping and things like that will be on a site plan. And it also has a lot of kind of ancillary information. And we'll get a little more into that later. And then a site condo or plat looks something like this. It is a site plan. It's just a specific type of site plan. Just for history's sake, I guess, plats were once the way that land was primarily subdivided. Most of Clawson was platted in the mid-20th century. And what that means is that they went through a process of dividing the land and figuring out where the streets were going to go, and then that was all recorded with the county. And in the late 70s, they passed the Condominium Act. And ever since then, the condominium process is a lot easier to go through than the plat process. So developers who are doing subdivisions all go through the site condo process. I've been planning professionally for 11 years now. I've never seen a plat. I've seen probably a few dozen site condos. So the likelihood of ever seeing another plat again is pretty low. it's a prohibitively complicated process. And it's also much harder to amend than a site condominium. You can also do a site condo right over an old plat, and it just wipes out the plat. So, whereas you have to replat if you want to do a new layout with a plat. So it's just several degrees easier to do a site condo in most cases. And then those last two are going to have a professional seal on them, and those confirm that the plan was prepared by a licensed professional. There are plans that have been delayed from coming to this body because that was not on them. It's happened multiple times in the last few years, in fact, and we had to work with applicants to get to that point where we had an actually professionally prepared plan and that was stamped by a professional who can certify that the work is done in accordance with engineering standards. So we do have to determine the review process when something comes in. That's going to be based on what's in our ordinances. Our regulations spell out what development goes through what process. And we have to be consistent following those standards. One of the first things that we do, especially if it's non-residential plan, is figure out whether or not the use is permitted in the district that it's proposed in. Because if it's not, then the whole thing kind of stops right there. If you could do a let's say somebody wanted to propose a gas station in the R1 district, that's obviously not something you can do because R1 is a single family district. So we would have to basically pump the brakes right there and say, look, we can't do a site plan on this because this isn't permitted there. But assuming that this is why you have a sign ordinance and do sign reviews. You don't want this. So this is the first type of administrative review. And the sign ordinance sets out the administrative review process. So it tells us who's going to do the review and how. And sign applications are checked for adherence to the sign ordinance. So if it's compliant, a sign permit gets issued. It's a pretty straightforward process. We look for compliance regarding the number of signs, their size, their height, their location, how the signs are illuminated. We don't look at the content of the signs, generally speaking, because our ordinance requires us to be neutral about the content, and that's based on federal case law. And what we try to do with a sign ordinance is to regulate signs so that they become an aesthetic asset to the city as opposed to the kind of clutter that you saw in that first image. And, being a community that's been around for a long time and lived through the mid-20th century when signs were kind of a wild frontier, we do have some legacy signs, lots of pole signs and things that are much, much larger than what's permitted now, that over time will eventually go away and be replaced with things that are conforming with our current ordinances. But that's kind of one of the challenges for older communities is that you have this legacy behind you, and our ideas change over time about what kind of development and what kind of signs and things that we want to see. So the things that we maybe wouldn't permit now do persist for a while as nonconformities. There's another example of kind of what things once looked like. 14 Mile had a lot of this at one point, and it's come a long way. Homes is another thing. Single-family homes are reviewed administratively, so we require a survey, a plot plan, and architectural plans. And those are reviewed by the building department for zoning ordinance and building code compliance. And they're also reviewed by engineering and DPW for grading, drainage, and utility connections. Accessory buildings for residential uses are also reviewed administratively. That's just a plot plan and architectural plans typically. We just want the dimensions. And those are also reviewed by the building department for zoning and building code compliance. Sometimes engineering and DPW will look at them. If someone's putting a utility connection out to one, they'll definitely be looking at that. If it's a large building, you might have some drainage implications from that. Pools and driveways also will change the drainage characteristics of a lot, so those might be glanced at by engineering as well. Fences are another thing that's reviewed administratively. So we get a plot plan. Typically, if it's on a shared property line, there's correspondence with the neighbor. And then that's reviewed by the building department for code compliance. Minor site changes are also subject to administrative review. Section 6.1.k of the zoning ordinance tells us what can be reviewed administratively. And those things will be reviewed by the building department for zoning ordinance and building code compliance. I've paraphrased and significantly shortened section 6.1k here because we'd be all night if we tried to go through every bit of it word for word. But there are certain accessory uses and structures that are incidental to conforming existing uses. Conversion from one permitted use to another under certain circumstances. If you're making alterations to become compliant with the Americans with Disabilities Act. Those are all things that can be approved administratively. We have a whole list of changes you can make to a facade that can be approved administratively. And then there's, on the flip side, a list of changes to a facade that can't be approved administratively that have to come to the Planning Commission.
And is that per our charter, or?
That's per the zoning ordinance.
Okay.
Yeah.
Let me rephrase the question here. I'm sorry. Some things, pretty much all residential, do not come to planning, right?
Yeah, single-family homes aren't going to come to the Planning Commission, yeah.
And my question is that per our charter, or is that per a state ordinance?
It's the
of some
zoning
kind?
ordinance, yeah. So there are communities that,
Do it.
well, I
I'm
can
not
think
saying I
of,
want to, by the way.
I can think of one community that has single-family homes frequently come to the Planning Commission. It's not so much the home, it's some of the other things that happen on the lot. It's just not a thing that's done, generally speaking. You'd have extremely busy agendas for the Planning Commission, but also, generally speaking, single-family homes are just generally not brought to a public body. It's just common practice, I guess. So if a proposed change to a site or use doesn't meet the criteria for administrative review, then it comes to the Planning Commission. They're going to be submitting a site plan. It's going to come here, and we get into those other types of review. So what is a site plan? It's really a set of documents and drawings. Sometimes it could be a couple sheets, and sometimes it could be 20 or 30, depending on the complexity of the project. And it includes information that's required by the zoning ordinance. And basically what we're looking for is the information that's necessary to make sure that a proposal meets the standards of our zoning ordinance. So it's going to include what's there now, it's going to include what's proposed to be there. If there's any natural characteristics of the site, that's going to show us that as well. It has to be professionally prepared. It's got to have that seal on it that I showed earlier. And if it's approved, it's legally binding. So any work you do on that site has to be in compliance with the approved site plan. And if it's not, then there's, enforcement processes that will occur. And if you have a major change to a site plan, then you might come to the Planning Commission to request approval of an amendment to a site plan.
Joe, question.
Sure.
You mentioned in certain cases they need approval, like engineering, whatever it might be. Can this body assume that like all of that has been checked and verified and has every kind of approval it needs before it comes to us? Or is
So-
that something we should keep an eye out for?
Full engineering review occurs after you look at it, so you will approve the layout of a site. And then it will go to engineering review, and they'll make sure that within that layout, drainage is going in the right direction, and all the curbs are the right height, and things like that. So engineering review is really the next step.
Okay. And the other approvals that you mentioned, like the steel and everything like that, is verified?
Yeah,
before it
that's
comes? Okay.
kind of on us to be looking at that and making sure that those things are included in the plan.
Okay,
Yeah,
thank you.
exactly. This is what the rooms that they prepared site plans in used to look like a long time ago. And actually, this is Harlan and Wolf who designed the Titanic. These guys here are designing the Titanic. But this is really what engineering offices used to look like. It was a bunch of people at tables doing things by hand, and of course, it does not look like this anymore. It's all computer based now, and everything's done in CAD, and we don't even have drawers anymore for paper files. It's all done digitally. So section 6.1C2 of the zoning ordinance sets out the required elements of a site plan. So it also establishes the process for site plan review. So it's a very long list. I didn't put it in here because it would just be slide after slide after slide. But there's a lot of stuff that needs to be included on a site plan in order for it to be considered a complete site plan that can be placed in front of the Planning Commission. So why do we require site plan review? Well, we've kind of talked about it a little bit already, but we're really looking to make sure that we're implementing our master plan via our zoning ordinance with site plan review. And it's that predictability that I talked about before. So if I come in and I buy a commercially zoned lot and I build a small restaurant on it, and I do everything right, and I put in all my landscaping, and I have my parking lot striped correctly, I want to know that the guy who comes in next to me is also going to do everything right and put in his landscaping and have his parking lot striped correctly and use the right building materials and things. So it's predictability for us, but it's also predictability for anyone who does business in town, really. It gives you kind of a little bit of a measure of confidence that everything's going to be done to a certain standard. So we get the authority to require all these reviews, really, not just site plan review, from the Michigan Zoning Enabling Act. You'll notice that has a 2006 date on it. That 2006 law and the Planning Enabling Act, which is the 2008 law, replaced the original Planning and Zoning Enabling Act, which was from the 1920s. And by the time it was replaced, it was a creaky old thing that needed to be replaced. So it's fortunate that a couple decades ago they actually did replace them. And the Zoning Enabling Act has been updated several times in the meantime, typically in regard to specific uses such as like adult foster care and things. They've put in some highly specific language about those things. But for the most part, it's, all the noticing language and things like that has remained the same. And then, of course, we have our local zoning ordinance standards that we established on the basis of the Zoning Enabling Act. In Clawson, site plans are submitted to the Department of Building and Planning, and review is conducted by the planning consultant, the fire department, public safety, the engineer and DPW, and the planning commission. Planning commission is listed last because all of us should have gotten to it before you get to it. So, fire department and public safety, typically we get a little, it looks fine to us from them, and they will do a more detailed review after the planning commission looks at it to make sure that, for instance, for the fire department, in their initial review, what they're looking at is they're making sure, okay, our truck can get in and it can get back out. And then they're going to look at the actual radii of every curb and things, in a great deal more detail after it leaves here. And some of those might lead to some minor modifications, like they might round off an end island a little bit to make sure that the truck can get around it. Engineering is the other one that does a much, much deeper review after it leaves your hands. When they look at it prior to it coming to the Planning Commission, they're doing kind of a general view of, all right, yes, it looks like they understand where the utilities are and what they need to bring to the building. That might be engineering and DPW's chance to say, hey, this has an old lead water service. You're going to have to replace that so that the applicant is aware of that going into the process. But they're going to really be looking at all the slopes and things in detail after it leaves here. So we do site plan review after we figured out that the use is permitted there and before any land development activity is allowed to occur. Those of you who've been on the Planning Commission for a while know that sometimes people jump the gun and we have to bring them in here to get a site plan approved before they can continue their work. So this is the basic process here. The pre-application conference is optional, but we do encourage people to do that, to meet with the development review team here and talk to us about what they want to do before they submit or even prepare any kind of formal plan. That's where we might look at one of those concept sketches. So they're saying, here's basically what we want to do. And once they get through that, they'll actually apply. The plan gets distributed and reviewed. Second review if necessary. I would say most things go through a second review because most things miss stuff up front. There'll be a little bit of information missing or just something that's just wildly not in line with the zoning ordinance and we have to say, hey, this needs to move. And then they'll do a revision and resubmit. And then once it gets here, it gets approved with conditions or denied. If it gets approved, either with or without conditions, it's then going to go to engineering. And once it gets through engineering, it'll go through permitting, then construction, and then inspection on the back end. If it gets denied, they have a few different recourses. They can appeal the decision of the Planning Commission to the Zoning Board of Appeals. That's always their first stop. And then if the Zoning Board of Appeals says, no, we agree with that the Planning Commission properly made its decision, then they would have circuit court as their next stop. Site plans are rarely outright denied unless there is some sort of major problem with the use or compliance, and the applicant just won't change it to become compliant. It's much more often that you're going to postpone and let them revise the plan to become compliant with the zoning ordinance. That's one of the things that distinguishes site plan review from the other processes we're going to talk about tonight. Those are more frequently denied. So reading a site plan, most of you have done this at this point, at least once. So a site plan, it's just all the details in words and pictures of how a site is going to be developed. So there's kind of a language to it. The key components, or some of them anyway, need to know the zoning of the property and its neighbors. What's the topography of the site? What structures are being proposed? What structures might already be there? Access, driveways. You need to have certain information on the plan. What's the scale of the plan? Which way is north? There should be notes saying things like, hey, we're going to shield all the lights down because that's one of your standards. And that might actually take the form of, here's a picture of the fixture we're going to use. You can see that it's a cutoff fixture. It's going to show parking. It's going to show landscaping. It's going to show all the details of the site and how it's proposed to be developed that we need to figure out whether or not it's going to be developed in a way that's compliant with the ordinance. So scale, just a quick reminder, the smaller the number, the larger the item is relative to real life. So 1 inch equals 10 feet is going to be a more detailed drawing than if your scale is 1 inch equals 40 feet. Everything's going to look a little smaller. We have lots of small sites in Clawson, so we tend to get larger scales here. We tend to get a closer look at things. In some of the more rural communities I work for, you might have a 103 acre site or something, and they've got to split it over multiple giant sheets just to get to the 1 inch equals 40 scale. We don't generally have that issue here. A legal description is another piece of information that's going to be on there. Well, you can see a few things here. So there's a note about drainage, there's a note about easements on there. It says they've done a title search and they stated that no easements exist on the site. And if they found some easements, they're going to have to say what they are and show where they are. And then that next section is the legal description. So it's got a parcel ID, the address, in this case it's in another community, 560 Haverhill Road, is the how the property is commonly known. But that legal description there, this bit of gobbledygook with all the numbers and vences and feet, that actually has like a highly specific meaning. It's rooted in a couple of land surveying acts from the very late 18th century when Thomas Jefferson was president. And basically he had the idea that you could throw a very rational grid over the entire unmapped part of the country and gradually survey the whole thing and carve it up into all these 6 mile by 6 mile squares that we now call townships. Of course, the Earth being a spherical object, the grid doesn't work as well as you might hope it would work. So there's all kinds of correction lines, and some townships are 4 by 8 and some are 6 by 6 and some are 6.5 by 6. But more or less what we have in the Midwest is that grid system, and our mile roads are based on that grid system. And what the property description is telling you is it's carving up that grid system into ever smaller grids. And it's saying that we're looking at the fourth quarter of the third section of the fourth section of this township, which is part of this county. It's like everything's got a number associated with it. And the property description is drilling down to get ever more specific about the location of the land. And then if you have, particularly if you have an irregularly shaped property, there's going to be a lot of headings and things that say for 225 feet, you're going to go this many degrees northwest. And then you're going to turn and you're going to go this many feet this direction and this many feet this direction, and that's how you get your actual property boundary. So legal descriptions could be, a legal description could take up this entire page if it was complex enough. But here we tend to have nice little rectangles, so they tend to be a lot less complex, and also they're generally part of a plat. And we can refer to a plat in a legal description because that plat will be on file with a county, and that makes the legal description a lot shorter. You're never, ever going to need to know how to read a legal description. It's just interesting. Topography, another thing. It's represented by contour lines or spot elevations in a very relatively flat area. You might accept spot elevations because they're going to just shows you here's 943, here's 942, and there's really not much more variation on this piece of land. But if you have hillier land, you're going to want contour lines to really show you how the land is actually shaped. Those are, if you're not familiar, those like curved lines that you'll see on a map that include all of the different elevations of various connected points on a piece of land. And this is necessary to tell us whether drainage on the site functions properly, And also things like the slope of a parking area is correct. So you don't want more than 4% because then carts and things roll all over the place. And then pedestrian walks have to be compliant with ADA. So you don't want more than a certain slope, or it's hard for someone with a wheelchair to get up it under their own steam. So those are all reasons that we would look for topographical information and spot elevations. There's just an example of a topographical map with all the little contour lines. You know, on a site plan for a lot the size of a typical lot in Clawson, you'd probably be looking at 1 foot contours because we don't have a lot of topographical variation, first of all, but also we have very small sites and it's not hard to show the 1 foot contours. So water always flows perpendicular to the contours. It's something that you can always look at. If you have 2 perpendicular contours going onto a neighbor's lot, that's probably a bad thing. Closely spaced contours is a steep slope, and widely spaced contours is a gentle slope. If you have a contour that closes on a plan in like a circle, that means there's a depression or a peak there. The ground should always slope away from structures, so the elevation should get lower as you go away from a building. And then you can't extend your grading beyond property lines. So you're probably going to grade a site when you develop it, but you can't grade onto the neighbor's property. You have to figure out ways to keep the water flow on your property and not sheet off onto the neighbor's property. And contours should never cross each other because you're probably going to have a very challenging site to develop if they do, because that would mean that something got tied in a knot. This is an example of the kind of thing where we really want to know what the slope is going to be, and the gradient of that ramp is going to be extremely important. It has to be a maximum of 1 to 12 feet of, or 1 to 12 ratio of run to rise. Rise to run. Because otherwise it becomes extremely difficult for someone to get up it in a wheelchair or to control themselves going down it, because you build up speed as you go down the ramp. That's typically reviewed by the engineer too, because it's really their expertise. It's a little example of an evaluation checklist where we're just looking to make sure that they've got all the information on the plan. Good design can be somewhat subjective, but it's not just like a site that looks good. It means that it's healthy and it's safe, that it works efficiently. You don't have situations where people who want to leave a parking space are constantly having to wait for someone who's unloading a truck or something like that. Public services have to be adequate. What's the future potential of that lot if this development is done? That's something we think about with all the senior centers going in now, is when there's less demand for them in 30 years, could they potentially be converted to apartments or something else? Natural features is another thing that we think about. Are there natural features that need to be protected? It's perhaps a less pressing concern in Clawson, but nevertheless, we do have stands of trees and things that we should be thinking about. Drains occasionally, depending on where you are in town. You should always be considering the actual characteristics of your site before you design it. Again, mostly flat rectangles, there's not as much to consider, but if you have an area where there's, wetlands or things like that, that's something that really needs to be considered up front when you're starting to design a plan. When you're in a built-up community, existing development and existing impervious coverage is one of your major considerations, right? Because your obstacle might not so much be that there are wetlands or a lot of topography or something. It's that, well, there's a building there already that needs to be taken down, and what happens after that gets taken down? Is the whole site kind of paved out? Is there any way that we could maybe claw back a little bit of green space when we're redeveloping it? Those are the kinds of things that we generally have to think about in a very built-up community. And this is something that we're going to be talking a lot about in the upcoming master plan process, community resiliency, and how site design can aid community resiliency. And that means a lot of different things. You know, it might mean that, well, we're just not putting as much water into our sewer system as quickly as it was going in there before the site was redesigned. That could be a major resiliency issue because it could help prevent localized flooding if you're doing it right. So you might have a paved out site right now that was built in 1957 and it has no underground detention. None of the water stays on the site at all. It just all sheets straight into the storm sewer. When it gets redeveloped and that parking lot comes out, you put a bunch of underground holding tanks for the water in it and a timed release so that the water slowly goes out into the sewer system. Over time, all of a sudden you've greatly diminished the chance that water is going to back up somewhere because a lot of it went in at once. So that's one of the things that we would be thinking about. There's
Hey, Jill,
plenty of others.
Can I
Yeah.
ask a question? Like the last site plan we looked at, they offered that within their plan. Is that something we don't require addressing right now at all? Or how are we addressing that currently?
We do. It's in the engineering standards. So the
Okay.
city leans on the county standards for stormwater. And yes, so a site that gets redeveloped now, and that's like full redevelopment, is definitely going to have to put in underground detention. In fact, they did it over on the ACE site too. They put in some underground detention there. When the existing building is being reused and the existing parking lot's being reused, then you're not really going to see that, generally speaking. But yeah, in this case, it's, 3 houses now. It's something else completely is being put there. It's definitely required to put
So
that
like
in.
what triggers that? Is it, because one could argue that even if we're pulling up a parking lot and, like, I know that Michelin didn't happen, but like, that parking lot potentially needed to be addressed and there were neighbors complaining of water. Is there something that gives us a little bit of leverage in those cases or no?
Yeah, it's hard to say. I mean, if there was a real serious problem, I suppose it might actually constitute a violation of some sort of ordinance.
Or are we looking to do something like that with our I guess maybe now is not the time to talk about that,
We're
but
definitely going to talk about it during the master
Yeah.
plan, yeah. I mean, that's the
Yeah.
whole first module, and we're actually going to talk about the scope of the master plan tonight. Yeah, I mean, it is something that we can talk about, and ultimately, it comes down to what engineering standards we put in place and what the triggers are in those standards. Like I said, right now, we kind of lean on the county standards here. So that's really what our engineer will look at.
and now, do you know how far back those are dated?
Actually, they were updated last year.
Last year?
Yeah,
Okay.
after a fair amount of time not being updated.
Okay.
So yeah, they were just updated last year. It was a long time coming. But yes, there are lots of resiliency-related items that we're going to be talking about in the coming months too, so stay tuned. Traffic is another thing that we can talk about. Traffic patterns are a function of land use. They're a function of site design. One thing I'll note is, I'm also a resident of this general area living over in Berkeley. And I've done lots of projects in big square communities that are further out. And traffic is like the number 1, number 2, number 3, number 4, number 5 concern in all those communities. And driving around those communities, I run into much worse traffic than I do here. And there are lots of reasons for that. One is that you have more alternatives for getting around for short trips in a compact area. Like you might walk to the pharmacy or something if you live close enough to walk to the pharmacy. And if you live in one of the big square communities, you probably don't live close enough to walk to anything. But also, we have this traditional grid pattern. And yes, we have mile roads just like all the larger, square, townships that became cities. But we have alternative means of circulation that they just don't there. Everything comes out of a cul-de-sac street onto a mile road, so everybody's got to go anywhere on a mile road. Whereas here, you can cut through all over the place. You can come out onto 14 Mile, like 28 different places from your neighborhood. And it makes a huge, huge, huge difference to the amount of backup that you get in an area and how quickly that backup is able to clear out. So there are a lot of advantages to Clausen's old-fashioned grid system that prevent it from descending into the type of gridlock that's very routine in a lot of other communities. That's not to say that we don't sometimes have traffic problems. We certainly do. But they are not on the sort of apocalyptic scale that they are in some other communities.
They probably get less speeders through neighborhoods, though.
I wouldn't
No?
say that necessarily because the streets are too wide in their neighborhoods.
Oh, okay. Well, I do have a question on this with the traffic, just in terms of ordinance and stuff like that. Because I've noticed that the more we, and different than what you're kind of saying, but like the other day, for example, I was like coming out of CVS and there was, it seems like that's something we and I know that there's not anything currently, but like the more we build density in these, like the Westgate area, it's like when you're pulling out, you don't know, you look 4 times, but there's cars coming from like 5 different directions,
Right.
going 5 different ways. And I don't know if we've talked about like the capacity for just like being able to turn left and how many drives are within that stretch to be able to actually safely turn left or things like, but I've noticed lately it's gotten kind of scary to turn left at certain places. And I don't know if that's something, at least since I've been on planning, we've never kind of like talked about, or like if there are a certain number of businesses that have a certain amount of traffic, how we would potentially consider putting a light there at Westgate or something like that. I don't know. Is that something we?
Right, so
Review.
traffic lights on 14 Mile are going to be a matter of warrants because it's a county road, and they have to, like the traffic in the area has to meet what's called a warrant, which means that has to be a certain volume and a certain number of conflicts in order to warrant a traffic light. But I actually have a whole bunch of slides about what you're going to talk, what you were just talking about, because it's access management. And how do we control the number of driveways and things? How do you create cross connections between sites so that you have fewer driveways coming out? Because, again, Westgate has a lot of legacy properties in it, right? So right at the corner there, the southeast corner of Crooks and 14 Mile, there's like all these auto uses that are just like no channelization at all. It's just like driveway straight onto the street for like 50 feet. And it's right next to the intersection. So a car could really be coming anywhere there. And that's the kind of thing that we try to avoid now. But it was once very, very common.
By what mechanism, though? So take, for example, the proposal for the 14 Mile apartments that we just reviewed last week. So imagine you have a dump truck that's coming in to collect the dumpster, right? It's a huge, wide, very long vehicle, and it goes in, and that part of it's straightforward for me. But when it's backing out, there's no place to turn around.
Yeah, well, they provided one, but yeah, often there's not.
Yeah, but it's kind of it's a turnaround for a Prius. I don't know if it's a turnaround for that big of a thing. So it has to back up. For example, let's say there isn't one for the moment to make it an easier discussion. So then they back out into the street and hold up all of westbound 14 Mile. Like, is this something we can control through
Yeah,
ordinance?
it is, because I think we would call that out if it had to back out onto the street.
Yeah.
You don't want that. I mean,
Right.
14 miles is a busy road. You don't want a garbage truck backing out onto it. Yeah, that's the kind of thing that we can call out and we can force changes to a plan for, yeah. 'Cause
Via
they have a public health, safety, and welfare aspect to them. And that's one of the primary things that our zoning ordinance is tasked to do, is to protect the public health, safety, and welfare. So yes, if there is something like that about a site that just isn't working, yeah, it can be addressed that way. Because we're looking for safe movement of everybody, not just people in cars. And yeah, that's a part of it, right? That safe movement has to occur both on site and on our roads, and when people are going between a site and the road.
And parking for that matter, right? I mean, I'm not familiar with the gentleman earlier, what he was saying, but I was pulling out of like Water to Go, and it is, with all the cars being parked there, it's
Well, it can be
really,
hard to see
I kind of
sometimes,
close
yeah.
my eyes and say a little prayer as I'm like, even just to inch up to see if anybody's coming, I already feel like I'm all like halfway into the street. And I know there's been talks about like diagonal parking there versus parallel, and if, I don't know if that's easier to see, but I do feel like there are certain areas that seem pretty vulnerable.
Yeah, there are, and curb extensions is one way one thing that can help that.
Yeah.
Actually, curb extensions is another thing that can slow down traffic through neighborhoods too. So those are all things that we can look at if we decide that those are goals of ours as we're working on the master plan. We can look at some of the Dutch have a term for it. They call it a woonerf, or a woonerf, I guess, because they pronounce the W like a V. And it's where you narrow a road so that only one car can go. So cars have to literally stop and wait for each other to get through, and it slows down traffic through neighborhoods. They do it all over the place there. It's become a little more common in the U.S. recently. Ann Arbor and Ferndale have both done some.
Ferndale's done some?
Yeah, Ferndale did it actually at a very reduced cost. If you drive, I'm trying to remember the name of the street that's 1 block north of 9 Mile. So you've got the parking lot behind those, like Pops
Right,
for
on
Italian in
Troy
the corner
there?
and all that.
Yeah.
Yeah. So if you go down Troy all the way to, is it Planavon? You'll go past a few. So take it all the way to the next major north-south road. You'll go past a couple where they've done these little kind of bulb outs, but at a very low cost. They didn't actually bring out the curbs. They did it with some kind of plastic material. And you have to stop if there's another car coming in the other direction. And because it was a problem, people just blowing through there to get around 9 Mile. So yeah, it's starting to happen here. And there are low-cost implementation methods. So yeah, this is exactly what we were just talking about, right? So the photo on the left, which must have been taken in like 1979, you can't really see the cars very well from here, but they're like all very late 70s. And then the one on the right is a somewhat different situation, but the one on the left is like the worst case scenario where there is no sense of like where you're supposed to pull in. There's not a driveway. It's just open, and you could pull in or out anywhere along that frontage. It makes it very, very unpredictable, and you could have two people trying to pull out at the same time, potentially going in opposite directions. On the right, this is a bit safer, but there's still an absolute ton of driveways, 5 of them in just a very, very compact span. And generally speaking, we want to try to avoid that if we can. When you come to a major intersection, and thankfully Clawson doesn't have any this big, but we've got a couple decent-sized ones. You know, this is a really rough situation. You've got two really kind of high-speed roads, wide, lots of lanes at the intersection, and then just driveways all over the place. This is not a very safe place right here. There's a lot of potential for accidents here. Those driveways on the northeast corner are like right on top of the intersection. You probably can never take a left out of either of them, is my guess. You know, it would be best just to close those two driveways. They're just a safety hazard. And you got plenty of other ways to get into that site.
Well, can I ask, sorry
Sure.
to keep stopping you, but can we implement the like no left turn thing within, like, how does that?
Potentially.
How does that move forward if we're noticing a lot of hazards? Let's say even, you know, with a new build, like the apartments that we're noticing, you know, with that light being there or something, that there's just a lot of, it just doesn't seem safe to turn left. How would that process happen?
It's probably got to happen at site plan. It's hard to
Okay.
do that retroactively. But for instance, the CVS has a pork chop at one of its driveways onto 14 Mile. You can really only go right in and right out because it channelizes you into doing that. You can't take a left. You can go onto the next site and take a left further down where it's further from the intersection. Cars aren't backing up beyond it. It's a lot safer. And that's the kind of thing that we need to be thinking about doing in the future. And it was done there, and it was done well, because all those sites could be separate from each other. There could be no cross-access between them, and then you'd have a real problem with the CVS site. But they were...
Wait, which CVS are you talking about? Are you talking about on Rochester or on Crooks?
No, the other one.
Crooks?
Yeah,
Okay.
Crooks, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, the one over on Rochester, there's some very odd stuff going on
Well,
over there.
it does
which-
feel awkward, though, it does feel like you have to go in this way and go out the other way. So I thought
Yeah.
that's what you were referring to.
Yeah, no, you know, over on the other, on the one at Crooks and 14 Mile actually has true channelized driveways. You cannot take a left out of it. You have to go on to the next site and go further down to take a left. And then that's what we should be doing. Yeah, we already just said all that. So kind of along with access management is site distance, just looking to make sure that people have the ability when they're pulling out of a site, or if the site's on a corner and there's two streets coming together, that you're not blocking people's ability to see down the road the distance that they need to see in order to pull out safely. And, you know, we have a standard in the ordinance in section 511 for corner clearance, where you've got to have these 25 by 25 triangles that are clear above 3 feet and below 8 feet, so that drivers can see without any kind of obstruction when they're trying to pull out somewhere.
So is that what it is there at the Ace by the water
No,
to go?
I think the on-street parking probably actually interferes with that somewhat. It's probably not actually in that 25 by 25, but it's so far out that I think because it's in the right of way. So I do think that it sometimes can get in the line of sight. And that's true of street parking pretty much everywhere. You have to move it pretty far away from a driveway or an intersection.
Right, there's not like a magic number of like, and I'm sure it's hard because every car is a little
There
different, right?
sort of is. It's based on speed limits, and not that everybody drives the speed limit.
Yeah.
But it is based on the speed of the road and how far you're supposed to be able to see down the road in order to
That makes
avoid
sense.
a near
Right, how
miss.
fast a car is coming.
Right.
Right, okay.
It makes a big difference.
For
If it's
sure.
25 miles an hour, you don't have to see very far. If it's 50 miles an hour, you have to see hundreds of feet down the road to be able to adequately judge whether or not it's safe to pull out. parking, I think we're all familiar with parking lots, but, we're really looking to provide not just a place to put cars, but a place to do it safely, because we need to think about how things work inside that parking lot too. A lot of parking lots are just sort of, a free-for-all. People just sort of have to pick where they walk and hope for the best. And cars might be coming from several different directions at once. So, we're thinking about the number of spaces that are required, but we're also thinking about design and location. Things like snow removal, that can take up a lot of space in the winter, especially if we have a bad winter. Back in 2013-14, it was giant piles of snow everywhere. You could hardly put your car anywhere. Last couple winters, it hasn't been such a big deal. But in a larger parking lot, things like end islands really help define circulation. They provide landscaping opportunities too, places to put trees that might help keep the heat down a little bit. They do protect the end vehicles as well. I don't know if you've ever had a ding on your bumper from somebody cutting a corner too hard in a parking lot. I had my bumper ripped off one time. That was fun. But if there's an end island there, it's much harder to do. And then perimeter landscaping defines it and buffers it from other things, such as maybe like a heavier circulation lane. And it's just an example of a well-done end island. It's got a lot of landscaping in it, but it's kept low so you can see over it. And then here's an example of kind of the opposite, where you don't have an end island and you're just sort of like peeking around this van like, is there anybody there? And you do have to kind of pull out into the lane to see around that van. Sites being designed for people. We're the ones who are going to the restaurants, and we're the ones who are getting our hair cut, and we're the ones who are buying sunglasses or whatever it is. You have to make sure that sites are usable for people. So, making your parking area as pedestrian friendly as possible is important. Especially for those of us who are not as big as others, little kids and things. They're hard to see in parking lots. This is just an example of how things can go a little wrong. So you've got about a 19-foot long car there. Now these are pretty nice townhome type units, but they're so close to the sidewalk that the car has to park across the sidewalk, and that significantly reduces the functionality of the sidewalk. So it either needs to be like right on top of the sidewalk, so there's no room to put a car there, or it needs to be far enough away that the car doesn't cross the sidewalk. The Michigan Motor Vehicle Code actually prohibits parking on a sidewalk. So this car would technically be in violation of the Michigan Motor Vehicle Code. Another thing to think about is cars overhang the sidewalks. So if you're going to have a situation where you're designing a site so that the cars can hang over the sidewalk, that sidewalk should be 7 to 8 feet wide so that someone in a wheelchair could still get around the cars if the cars are hanging 2 feet over the sidewalk. That's all part of barrier-free design, really. So we do have some ADA requirements, ramps, signage, number of parking spaces that are required on every site. Utilities are something that we don't look at in any great detail here, but they do need to be shown conceptually on a site plan that comes to the Planning Commission. And then they'll be shown in greater detail later on when they get to engineering review.
Just going back one to the accessibility there for ADA. On that apartment complex project from last week, there was one spot, one handicap spot.
Yes, they did have one, yeah.
But just one, and there's 14 proposed units there, so better only be one disabled person living there.
Yeah, they calibrate the ratios as well as they can. It's all in the building code, which is adopted in response to the ADA. Generally speaking, the ratio is if you have a site that is 25 spaces or less, you're required to have one. And if you have, like for every 25 over 25, you add another one. That's what's
for
required.
housing or that's for
That's for everything.
McDonald's? That's for everything,
yeah,
period.
It's just straight across the board, yeah.
But kind of different for residential, right? In practice, like if you're living there.
Yeah, I mean, if you wound up with two people in that situation, you would probably just have to, I mean, I suppose the landlord could always stripe one of the spots, retroactively. But you just have a situation where you probably are going to have a little bit of competition for the space, most likely. And there are uses that intentionally add more than they need. Under ordinances, like doctors' offices tend to have more than they need because they're going to most likely have more people coming who have some sort of, like if you're a physical therapist or something, you probably have a lot of people who are coming there who aren't going to walk all the way across the parking lot. So you might stripe 5 or 6 spaces when you only need 2,
Thank you.
Sure. Screening, buffering, and landscaping is another thing that we always consider. We always have base requirements in our ordinance, and that's one of the most challenging things to figure out if you've got it correct in your ordinance. Do we have enough trees? Do we have enough of this? It's a little bit of an art, I guess, more than a science, because it depends on what kind of trees you put in, and it depends on, how far from the property line you plant them, and there's lots of different variables that go into it. So you try to have some base standards and perhaps build in enough flexibility to require a little bit more or allow a waiver if there's some sort of circumstance that warrants it. But generally, you're trying to soften the transition from one use to another. But you're trying to do it in a way that doesn't completely obscure a use. Like, it's hard to even see the sign at this gas station here. And also, you're buffering this fence that I've circled in red here. Well, if you're pulling out of that parking lot and there's a kid on a tricycle on that sidewalk, it's really hard to see that kid or their parent behind them even. So this fence really should be lowered as it gets closer to the sidewalk to allow that visibility that it's missing right now. It should come down to 3 feet from 6 feet. It's another very old photo. I think that's like an 86 Buick or something like that. And then, of course, you have the situation where you might have a use that's just, it might be necessary, but it's really ugly. So you want to have the ability to say, all right, let's do something to screen this so that people don't have to look at it. Lighting, of course, is another thing that we always look at. We're always looking for compliance with zoning standards as usual, but we're thinking about glare, we're thinking about location, we're thinking about how tall it is, and we're thinking about the safety of the site as well. We don't necessarily want a parking lot to be pitch black at night. But, we might also want all the lights to dim so that for most of the night they're not going to be very bright, and then if someone walks onto the site, they maybe come up. We have the technology to do that now, so there's really no reason not to do it. Avoiding glare is probably the number one thing. A little bit of light trespass is annoying, but nothing's more annoying than glare when you can just see the source of the light, and every time you look at it, you get the little, star points. It just changes the whole character of the light that's coming to your site, and it's much harsher when that light element is visible.
Where do we see that in our ordinance, Joe? I know in the park we have, for the tennis courts, they have those like shields, and they're amazing. They eliminate that completely, but I've
Yeah.
never seen them anywhere else.
Yeah, so we do have it in our ordinance now. I think it was only, oops, didn't mean to do that. It was only added there, probably 15 years ago, something like that, maybe 10. It was not there for a long time, so we do unfortunately have a lot of lighting in town that doesn't quite meet those cutoff standards, and you do get glare off of it. But anything new that goes in should be going in with a fixture that is cut off and does not produce that glare. And if it's adjacent to residential, it should be going in with house side shielding to reduce the possibility of glare even more. It's somewhere in Article 514 or something like that. Hazardous materials is another thing. We don't do too much with this, but it's usually something we'll ask, like if someone's doing like an auto garage or something, hey, what do you do with your used oils and things like that, just to make sure that they're thinking about it and that they understand that they have to have certified disposal systems for that. Accessory structures and uses. On a non-residential site, you're really just making sure that they're actually integrated with the site and it's not like a shack next to a decent-looking commercial building. And usually on a commercial site, those are going to have to meet the setbacks that the principal building is going to meet. And this is a shopping cart example of an accessory structure where there's a lot of different ways you can do it. Sometimes they just sort of throw the thing out there, but other times it's actually built into the parking lot with islands in this case. So on a site plan, we have some key decision-making criteria. We're looking at the standards that are in the ordinance. We have plan content standards, so stuff that's information that needs to be there. And we're just checking to make sure it's there. We have discretionary standards like facade shall be harmonious with the area. That's a matter of interpretation for the Planning Commission. And there are lots of standards like that. And then we have non-discretionary standards where it has to be 10 feet from the property line. Is it not 10 feet from the property line? So if we find that all those discretionary standards are met and it's clear that all the non-discretionary standards are met and all the information's there, then we have to approve a site plan for a permitted use. That's just what the statute says. If you're going to put conditions on a site plan approval, it has to be related to meeting a specific ordinance standard. You also can delay action, of course, if you have an incomplete application. We try not to let those get to you, but sometimes an applicant will press the issue. If there's extensive changes required, if they're requesting a delay, you can always delay. Sometimes little things can just be handled as conditions. You generally don't delay for that. You just make them conditions of approval. Minor changes can usually be reviewed administratively. If they have to lower their light fixtures from 22 feet to 20 feet to be in compliance with the ordinance, you can just make that a condition of approval. So a final site plan doesn't authorize construction. It usually has to go through engineering review after that. They're going to have to probably submit a plan that meets whatever the conditions of approval were. So if we said they had to lower the fixtures from 22 to 20 feet, well, they need to submit a plan that shows the fixtures coming down to 20 feet. And then that's the legal basis for all their inspections. So if we go out and we find that the lights are 22 feet high, they need to bring them down to 20 feet because they were approved at 20 feet. And then, of course, we keep records of all that on file. Now, we just said that if a site plan meets all the standards of the ordinance, it has to be approved. When we go to the next level of review, which is special land use review, we have a lot more discretion about whether or not a special land use gets approved. So special land uses are generally uses that are deemed to have a greater level of intensity or potential impact than the principally permitted uses in a district. So they require a public hearing at the Planning Commission, the 15-day notice and notice to all the neighbors. They might not be appropriate at all locations in a given district. So you might have a commercial district that's in several different parts of the city, and in most of those places, it's not directly adjacent to residential. But in one area of the city, it is. You might say, well, okay, we understand you want to drive through, but we have houses right over the fence, and there's not a lot of land here. We have other land that got this zoning on it. Drive-through is more appropriate there. We might actually turn that down because it's just not appropriate in that location. That's just one example. So we do have standards of review, and they're fairly extensive. Basically what they're trying to do is judge the harmony of that use with its surroundings. And that's the TLDR version of it. The Planning Commission, this is all from our ordinance, section 6.2. The Planning Commission shall find that a need for the proposed use exists in the community at the time the special land use application is considered. That's kind of a high standard, actually, that there's a need for it. Well, it's also fairly subjective. Determining that, maybe they've got a market study or something that shows there's demand for it, but they might not come in prepared with any information to testify to that. So you might have to actually talk it out with them. Why do you think this needs to go here? And these standards go on a little bit, so I won't get into detail on them, but we also have a process for special land use revocation. So if a special land use is granted and for some reason it becomes an issue for surrounding properties, we actually have a process for sending written notice to an applicant, holding a hearing, and then making findings. And if the findings are adverse, there might be fines, and the special land use could potentially be revoked. Now, typically, you're going to give people a lot of opportunities to remedy the problem before you go to that step. But nevertheless, the process is there in our ordinance. And if they were to attempt to continue the use, they would have to essentially come in with a new special land use application.
Joe,
If you
can I
were
ask
to
a
revoke
question?
their-
And I'm probably not going to word it correctly, so don't be offended. But what's the difference between special land use and like spot zoning?
Well, special land use there's going to be a list of special land uses in the zoning ordinance for that district. So these are things that have been contemplated for that district.
Okay.
And they just might not necessarily be equally appropriate everywhere in the district.
So, but okay, because I forget what we were discussing one thing where I'm like, well, it seems like it would fit on that parcel, but maybe not that whole district. So this is a way you can allow that without it being like considered spot zoning or.
Exactly, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, it's actually set right out in the statute. In fact, a lot of older ordinances use the term conditional zoning, and we always encourage communities to change to the term special land use because that's what's in the statute. Conditional zoning technically doesn't exist, based on Michigan law. So a special land use is the term you want to be using. But yes, that's really, it is a mechanism for doing that kind of thing.
Okay, and if it's not listed in there, then they wouldn't even make it to us though, right?
No, exactly.
Okay,
Yeah.
okay.
Yeah.
Now, do we review that ever so often? Because I don't think we've like really reviewed just the list of special, because if we're talking, again, I hate to jump ahead, but like, our master plan and looking at those, BRD 2 and 3 and thinking about the changing times and what might be good for developing Clausen, would we be able to do that as using special land use seems like it might be a good way to kind of test, I hate to use the word test, but kind of like get a feel for what it might be like there, right? Or am I saying that wrong? I don't know.
I mean, it could be. But yeah, I mean, during the planning process, as we're looking at those areas, we can consider what our goals for those areas are. And then after we've adopted the plan, we can look at the ordinance and really look at that list of uses and say, does this make sense? Are we missing something? Do we have stuff in here that doesn't meet those goals? And that we have a chance to then adjust it to further the goals that we've set in the master plan.
So you wouldn't say it as like, well, here's our, we'll kind of ease into it with the special land use, opening it up to special land use, seeing if it works well for that area, that zone, and then potentially building it into a master plan. Would that be an appropriate way of going about things?
I think generally speaking, you want your plan to lead. You want to have a vision for the area.
Okay.
And then try to match the uses that you're permitting, whether they be permitted or special land uses, to the plan, to the
Okay.
vision. And actually, that takes us to rezoning, which is the next level of review. And this is also a somewhat discretionary approval. So really, for rezoning, we're looking for consistency with the master plan. And that doesn't necessarily mean that it 100% is a match for the future land use designation of that property. There could be other circumstances that make it appropriate there. But one thing to consider is that when you rezone something, all the permitted uses in that new district are permitted on the property. So you do need to look at everything. If someone wants to rezone something commercial to do an insurance office, let's say it's an old house and it's on like a mile road. Okay, well, that's not too bad. But that same district also permits gas stations and, delicatessens and all kinds of other things. Well, you might not necessarily want that there because there's just a bunch of houses around it. So one thing that an applicant can do when requesting a rezoning is they can voluntarily offer conditions on the rezoning, such as limitations on permitted uses, or that they're only going to do a building of a certain size and no larger, or something like that. And that can make a rezoning a little more palatable. It's administratively a little weird because you've got this parcel that's suddenly orange on your zoning map that doesn't actually fully have the zoning that it's shown having on the map because they've said, well, we're not going to do any of these uses on it. And there's actually an agreement in place that legally prohibits them from doing those units. So conditional rezoning should really be marked on a zoning map with like a hash or something like that so that it's clear that there's something unusual about the way that lot was rezoned.
Is that deeded? Is that through a deed? Like, if once it exchanges hands, is there a deed that follows that for that permitted use?
It's done via a contract with the municipality, but that contract should be reported to any subsequent purchasers of the land.
So if the said purchaser pulled info, is there a way that they would see that on the deed or anything like that?
That's a good question. It depends a little bit on how you do it. Some communities would require an amendment to the deed and others wouldn't. I'd have to look at, I don't think we have any such requirement. But we also have a rezoning section in our ordinance that I think probably could use an update in a few more paragraphs to clear up some of the information that we're looking for. So that might be something we're looking at in the next year anyway.
Okay.
Conditional rezonings, I prefer that they don't become like every rezoning is a conditional rezoning, because I've worked in communities where every rezoning is a conditional rezoning, and it gets very difficult to manage very quickly. The process for rezoning here is that it goes to a public hearing at the Planning Commission, and the Planning Commission makes a recommendation to the City Council, and then the city council has the final ability to approve or deny the rezoning request, and then they would have to come in for development review after that. The reason that city councils or township boards or whatever kind of form of government you're working under have to approve rezonings is that they're actually an amendment to the ordinance, because the zoning map is part of the ordinance and you're amending the zoning map. So that would require, any amendment to the ordinance requires a public hearing, and the legislative body is the only one that can amend an ordinance. And that brings me to the final type of development, which we have only ever done one, all the way to completion in Clawson, which is the planned unit development. And a PUD, this is something they put in the Zoning Enabling Act to foster innovative development or permit development that's not otherwise achievable under an ordinance. So the first thing that has to happen is that the Planning Commission has to qualify a planned unit development for consideration. They come in with a conceptual plan, and the Planning Commission says, we have these criteria that we measure it against. And the Planning Commission says, yes, it appears to meet these criteria. You can move forward with coming in with a final PUD plan. It's really supposed to be a negotiation between the applicant and the city. So you can permit variations to zoning ordinance standards, like what's permitted in that area, or the height of the building, or setbacks, or the amount of parking that's required. There's really not much of a limit on what you can permit variation from, but you should be doing that in exchange for benefits and a type or quality of development that's not otherwise permitted. It requires final approval by the city council, which enters into a contract with the developers, a written agreement that goes along with it. Site plan approval is required as part of the PUD process, and it can't be appealed to the ZBA.
So we'll go back to that last part then.
Sure.
So I describe a PUD as a bypass to our existing ordinances. So instead
That's-
of working through our ordinances or challenging the planning commission or the city council to fix ordinance problems that are self-evident, the PUD just says, nah, we're just going to do it our way. And the last part is the most interesting one to me, and that is that the PUDs cannot be appealed to the ZBA. So does that mean the site plan that comes to the planning commission, purportedly at that point in agreement with the planning commission?
Right.
If we don't come to an agreement, it doesn't go to the ZBA.
Right. They can't appeal the planning commission or city council's decision on a planned unit development to the ZBA.
Okay.
That's just the statute set it up that way. You can make a carve out in your ordinance if you choose to. But basically, if the city council turns down a PUD, it goes straight to circuit court if they decide to pursue further action on it. But yeah, I mean, ideally, a planned unit development is not an end run around the ordinance. It's an attempt to, do something that wasn't necessarily predicted in the ordinance in a way that benefits the community in some tangible fashion. You might get, I don't know, street parking or a small parklet or something out of it that you wouldn't have gotten in conventional development. There are a lot of different ways it can play out.
We didn't get a park from our PUD. I wish you would have gave us that.
Bicycle rack.
That's true, bicycle rack, yeah.
Yeah.
Think I would have asked for one.
But, well, they do have a bicycle rack on that one.
But in principle, if the city wanted to, they could modify these amendments, or these ordinances or amend the ordinances to accommodate whatever plan was necessary.
In theory, yeah. You might wind up creating a bunch of districts or kind of a ton of standards that are in your ordinance that, otherwise don't have to be there to accommodate a single development.
So is the spirit of it, in essence, to control the exceptions to a very specific area?
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah, it's to make it site-specific and also just to have a great deal of control over what you're doing. If you're giving up height, you're getting something in return, and you're only giving it up to a point that you're comfortable with, for instance. That's really what it's for. And these are something that we can look at too, are the standards that we have in our ordinance, and do we like these eligibility criteria, you know? Some communities are highly specific about what they're looking for from a PUD. It can only be in these certain areas of the city, and it has to include mixed-use development. That's a standard you could have for planned unit development. And others are extremely loose about it. Others kind of allow it to be an end run around the ordinance, which I don't recommend. But nevertheless, there are a lot of ordinances that are kind of like that. It's a process. It's a big process. You know, there's preliminary and final review, and it's not a light lift to do a planned unit development, but it shouldn't be either, you know, because they are asking for something special. So it usually takes, you know, half a year at least to get through a PUD process. That's actually the end of the slideshow. Yeah, so that's it. That's the little development review training. Just, you know, we don't see some of these things very often. So just kind of bringing your attention to some of the possible applications that we might get at some point in the future, and then, you know, just kind of a refresher on some of the principles behind how we review these things. And yeah, I don't have anything else to do for that, so if you've got any other comments or questions, we can do that. Otherwise, we can move on to the next agenda item.
What was the next agenda item? I'm sorry. You're going to go over the master plan, you said?
Yeah, we were just going to very quickly talk about the scope for the master plan that was approved recently, because we're kind of planning on how exactly we're going to tackle it.
Okay, I didn't see that on the agenda, but totally okay with that. So I don't know if my questions would be better addressed for that or for this. But I'll save them for the master plan.
So there's kind of two projects, actually. One is the downtown master plan, which is funded by the DDA, and that's going to be occurring at the same time as the rest of the master plan update. So we are going to be looking at the downtown master plan. And we're going to be specifically addressing the streetscape downtown, the parking and traffic assessment that was recently done is going to be used as a basis for some of the study that's done there. And we're going to be looking at the layout of 14 Mile and the possibility of perhaps some pretty big changes there. And we're also going to be looking at, just in general, the district boundaries and things like that, and maybe some specific sites that could use a little nudge. It's going to be a fairly simple update of the downtown plan, fairly narrow scope. But we are nevertheless going to be looking at the downtown master plan and updating the some of the concepts that are in there, and just trying to identify any changes that are needed that might help the downtown along on its progress. And then the larger master plan update process, which will be kicking off somewhat soon. We're just working on the timing, really. We have a kind of public engagement process that we're putting together for it that's going to try to offer both in-person and online ways of interacting with the process. And what I've found over the last several projects like this that I've done is that we tend to get the best feedback when we ask some questions up front and then come back to people with our responses to those questions. So we might develop some concepts and things based on what we heard initially, and then allow people to respond to that and then make adjustments in response to their responses. So it's sort of like a three-tiered public input process where you ask people what they think up front, then you ask them what they think as you're going along, and then you ask them what they think at the very end, so that they get a chance to kind of look at everything as a whole and say, all right, here's what we think, and then you make any adjustments that you need to make along the way. So we have really, what we did is we kind of organized the master plan update as modules. So module 1 is infrastructure. We're going to be talking about the thoroughfare plan, complete streets, the road maintenance framework, a water and sewer framework, and green infrastructure and flood prevention. Module 2 is the school district site development at Shulman Baker. That's kind of closing the loop with the school district on that one and making sure that what we put in this plan is in line with their action plan.
Joe, is there something you can screen share just so we can follow along?
It's kind of just a bunch of small texts on.
Oh, it is, okay.
Yeah,
I didn't
not-
know if it's what, okay.
Because I'm kind of following along. The council packet from, I think this past meeting
It was a past meeting. Yeah.
is outlining exactly what Joe's referring to.
Okay.
Yeah.
So that's where I'm looking.
Thanks.
We are going to take a look at parking in the DDA district, but we're also going to extend that study outside the DDA district to look at how we're handling parking kind of on a citywide basis and what changes could be made there. We have a sustainability and resiliency plan that builds on the framework that's already been developed. Module 5 explores the possibility for additional mixed-use development in strategic locations. And then we have our reevaluation of the BRD districts, the West 14 Mile and the North Main corridor. So that's the kind of the meat of it, and there's of course all the little technical things like updating the map and implementation strategies and things like that that go along with it. But those are the 6 areas of focus aside from the downtown plan that we are going to have as we do this plan. And, you know, if anything else arises as we go along, of course, we'll address it. But that's really going to be the focus areas. And again, we're just kind of basically trying to figure out what the timeline looks like and when we're going to start each of those modules, because we probably will do them more or less sequentially, but we might have a couple modules going at the same time. Some of the larger modules might run concurrent with each other. Downtown infrastructure and sustainability might all kind of run along with the rest of them.
Joe, was this presented to us when we were going to city council? Our whole module thing? Because that was actually surprising to me when I saw it on city council meeting, because there were other things that we spoke about that aren't even discussed in that. And then especially the school site plan, which I know you didn't present it initially to the council, but we voted, we didn't accept the school plan. So
No,
to
it
use
wasn't.
that as
It wasn't
a springboard.
It wasn't
seems-
passed at the time, and the idea here is that we take a step back from what was done in the past, and we meet with the school board and
Yeah, but like that
develop.
wasn't even conveyed to council. It was like, oh, well, we already did all this work for the Shulm site, so look at, we've got all this work done. But I'm like, wait, we never approved that work for the school
Well,
site.
I think the work that has been done that will be carried forward is more the demographic update and all that, like, kind of, grunt work that happens at the beginning of a plan, that a lot of it's been done already, that it doesn't have to be redone this time. As far as concepts and things that came out of that plan, the focus of this module here is going to be talking to the school district and making sure that whatever goes into this plan is in line with their thinking and planning for the sites.
So it sounds like DDA, are they driving that focus? And then the school's
They
driving
are.
the other focus? So,
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, yeah.
okay.
I echo what you're saying.
I was a little shocked, yeah.
Yeah, and I don't know that I needed to be. I mean, I think we ought to start from somewhere, and I think, if we broadly use words like framework and, starting points, I think what you prepared for the council is in line with it, But I admit, I was also startled by it a little bit, and I thought this is a little bit of the cart getting ahead of the horse. And I'm not sure, I spoke up at council about it as well, and I said, if we're not careful here, we're going to lose focus on the critical things that I think we all did discuss in our planning commission meetings that have to really get front center attention and execution, and then other things, unfortunately, we might not put as much priority on or not. And then the school, the Shalom thing was like, wow, where did that come from?
Yeah.
So-
Are we gonna
I
present
just
that
feel
as
like
if it was-
it's a loose end that needs to be tied up.
And that's exactly right. Yeah.
I agree. It was
yeah.
presented as if, like, here's our plan, we already did it for you guys.
Oh, yeah, I mean, I
That's
guess
at
I
least
wasn't
how
there, but.
I shouldn't say it was that's how I interpreted the presentation of it, and I'm like, what? Wait.
The other thing, Joe, briefly, is just that I didn't know we were signing the city up for that expense, right? I know that the mayor, I think, led the discussion, like, is this right? And for all I know, this is a great discount. This is a very good deal for the city to be doing it.
It definitely is.
I think it is too. I've looked at a few other cities, and I think it is. So don't take it this way. Like, it could be $20 fee. Let's be more realistic, but it could be $10,000 or $5,000. And I didn't know when we agreed to even propose what we were proposing that we were signing up the city for a bill, and no problem doing that if it just, I didn't know I was doing it. So that part of it startled me a little bit, and blame that on just my inexperience in the matter. So, thank you. So for the first part, you said a month, like module 1 or task 1, I think, is like a month out.
Yeah, that's kind of just getting the beginning part of the plan together. And then I anticipate module 1 will be a decently lengthy process because we've got a lot of study to do there.
Yeah. By June, is that a reasonable completion?
Well, I think, I don't know that we complete it by June, but we would definitely be well into it by then.
Okay.
I think they said like 18 months when they were in front of council.
Overall, yeah, the whole thing to final adoption, yeah. Because the thing about adoption of a plan is that just adopting it, once you've got a final draft that everybody's happy with, just adopting the plan takes like 4 months because there's these review periods and things, and there's just all this downtime where just time goes by and other agencies have the plan in hand.
So my request is just, if we could, and it may take 6 weeks to do it, but if we could get it into a Gantt chart format so that we know who has to do
Yeah.
what and by when, and that it's very clear. I would actually like to aspire to have it be done much sooner than 18 months, even if that meant scope change reductions, just so that we had it. Because this is a changing commission, and it's, if the whole thing changed in a few months or a year even, it's unfair to you, I think, trying to execute it with different people's input. So when it draws out that long, it's sort of hard to be effective, I think. But a Gantt chart would really help, I think, illustrate where the big rocks and the small rocks are.
Yep, yeah, that's the idea. And then the thought was, for the most part, what we would try to do is conduct regular business at one of the monthly meetings and then have the other monthly meeting be a study session for the master plan, generally speaking. We might talk about the master plan at both meetings some months, but, and then of course there would be other events as well, open houses and things wouldn't happen during this meeting. So we'd have to figure out what the best times to schedule some of those things are. We have the 2 meeting a month structure, so I think we can use that to efficiently complete the plan and have all the discussion that we need to have as we draft it within that framework of our current meeting structure. And then we've got the second meeting for site plans and other things that we
Sure.
need to be talking about.
Would it make sense to just establish here and now that we have a standing section on the agenda for specific portions of that agenda or that Gantt chart activity? I watched the Charter Commission go from 0 to 60 in the last, like, month and a half, and I can't help but wonder, like, if they knew they were going to be that, constrained at the end, if they would have budgeted their time earlier a little bit, so.
Sure, yeah. Sometimes it can happen where the work gets a little bit globby. But yeah, I do think it would be reasonable to anticipate that we would probably have one meeting a month that's pretty much devoted to the master plan, and then possibly a small section of the
Or even just,
meeting.
15 or 20 minutes or 30 minutes per meeting. I think that, like, just to keep us on a tempo so that we're constantly mindful of, are we ahead of the timeline? Are we behind the timeline? What do we need to be
Sure.
prepared of for thinking about? I just need that structure, so. if
I
we-
echo that, like, even if it's just, sorry not to cut you off, but just if even it's like a planner report at the end.
Oh,
We can make it like
yeah,
a line
no,
item
I
just to
completely
update
understand
what's
that,
happening.
yeah.
And-
Yeah.
Because
Yeah.
I guess one of my questions, which I'm sure my fellow commissioners are trying to understand, is like what percentage of the work is, Giffords and Webster going to be doing without our purview to bring together information in between when we meet, and what oversight will we have throughout the process? I
Yeah,
definitely-
there probably is going to be, particularly up front, like a lot of us getting information together to give to you so that you can process it
Right.
and make clear-eyed recommendations.
Yeah, and there's parts that I don't want to speak for everybody, but I would love to be more involved with. When you talk about
Sure.
if there's questionnaire and thing to, members of the community and things like that. I don't know if you plan on taking like all of that away from us. to
Well, it has
help.
to go through you. I mean, obviously, what we can do is we can try to identify issues for investigation and then talk to you about what you might want to know in relation to each of those issues. And then we can take that and develop, just generically, let's say a survey, but it might be something else even.
Yeah. And that was just one
and-
example, like just
yeah,
the survey,
and-
for instance, but.
And, then, we would bring that back to you and say, here's what we came up with, make adjustments to it, and then it can go live. That's the idea. And, anytime we have a workshop and things, we would obviously talk about that. We might use that 15 minutes to talk about, okay, workshop coming up in a month and a half. Here's what the topics are likely to be. And then we talk about how we want to tackle it.
Okay.
We specifically asked for a workshop at the last city council meeting between council and planning, and it's sort of a vague thing, I think, right now, but Chairman Kusara raised that up, and has multiple times, and we just never
We'll
got
get one
to it.
scheduled, yeah.
Yeah, we've done it in the past. I think it's always been good when we have.
Joe, I don't know. There's a couple of things that I guess I don't know if they'd be addressed best through master plan and where they might fall into those modules, but, things, and I know that city council is ultimately who does ordinance type things, right? But like vacant land or vacant lots, buildings that are kind of decrepit, being able to have something that addresses those, I would feel like, we've talked about it before, being in our potentially master plan, or at least addressing those, but would that be something that would fall along the lines of like resiliency and being able to stop blight from happening?
Yeah, I think so, because it speaks to the economic resiliency of a community.
Yeah, well, and I would think lots of ways it could fit in, right?
Yeah.
Just not economic, but truly, it's not great for the environment either for buildings to be, wasting away. And do we have anything that addresses condo conversions in our ordinance, or is that something, with a lot of the multifamilies happening, the potential for condo conversions down the road, those can happen successfully with a successful HOA, and they can happen, and that can wear down cities, in a very not good way. And then,
Yeah, I don't know that we have anything on our on the books about condo conversions at the moment.
And is that something that we'd be able to discuss potentially, just because we're seeing a lot of these new multifamilies building, I've seen condo conversions that the HOA, like Michigan law, I forget how much they require, like 10% or something for the HOA. I forget what it is. But, once they sell them out, essentially, they can wear down really fast, right? The depreciation's all gone, and, these are kind of turned to blight eventually. So I'm wondering if that's something we can maybe discuss.
Sure, yeah, and I'd have to study the issue a little bit. I'm not really familiar with it too much, so. All right.
And then bike lanes, or not bike lanes, sorry, I don't want to say that, but just a more bikeable community, but I'm sure that's in the resiliency stuff. Joe, is that right? Or
It's
Josh?
addressed
You
there
guys
and
talk about it there
also,
too, right?
also in transportation and
Oh, okay.
infrastructure, so.
I think you guys discussed making it more bike-friendly.
There's some information, yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
Not in great detail, but it's definitely addressed.
okay.
Yeah, well, I think the bike map that's in the existing master plan would certainly be updated and studied again.
Was that built already into the modules, or is that something we'd have to do
No, it's
outside of it?
included. It's included.
Oh, it is included? Okay.
Are you complete?
Yeah, I didn't have anything else.
Sorry, what was the timeline? So this framework, if you want to call it that, sorry, the modules, was approved by city council, so.
That's right.
What did you have in terms of a timeline for the initial kickoff or next steps?
Well, we're probably looking at an initial kickoff at, most likely the first meeting in June is going to be when we're really kicking this off. And then we would base the rest of the timeline on that start date. So as we try to put together our timeline, that's what we would have in mind. But yeah, the next step for us is to really kind of say, all right, here's what we're going to be working on and when.
Any further questions, comments? Okay, thank you then. Let's move on to agenda item number 8 is other business.
Just two things, Mr. Chair.
Sure.
Under new business, right? Or
Other business.
other business, okay. Last meeting we had on the apartment proposal really got a lot of things rolling in my head, and I imagine it probably could have come out differently, but, it was news to me that that this could happen, that, a neighbor could wake up one day in Clausen and find out that the 2 or 3 or 4 houses next to them are being legally resold, and a very different type of residence, constructed in its place. And it's interesting, today we had, I think, 2 of the adjacent neighbors here, which was encouraging, but I don't think that was required, and I'm aware in other neighborhoods that is required, other cities that would be required to have some level of notice and participation, and so I'm proposing next meeting to have a motion made to consider an ordinance change to revise how we handle residential sites for this purpose, to convert multiple or to recombine, I should say, individual lots into larger lots. There is language in the ordinance that I found that describes how to divide them, but I don't see anything fresh that specifically, characterizes how to recombine them. And I think it's a betrayal, frankly. I think the residents of Clausen should know that they don't have to be at every meeting every week to know that this could be happening next to them, and even, that there is some stability to the neighborhood, that they don't wake up one day and find themselves the only single-family home on a street, And I think there are numerous points in the master plan that do that. So on the next meeting, I'd like to prepare you guys, just as a courtesy or as a requirement. I'm not sure what I'm required to do, frankly, but next meeting, I would like to propose a detailed motion to that effect. The second thing I'd like to bring up at our next meeting will be a request to consider an update to our ordinance to specify the execution of temporary occupancy permits. It was established, I think, a number of meetings ago quite clearly that this falls under the building department, where we have no concern about its execution, but as a matter of protocol, some oversight over this process that bypasses the planning commission, bypasses perhaps the site plan approval process. I saw a few temporary occupancy permits that were legally and properly, released just in the last couple of weeks, I think. But I think it remains kind of a sticking point after how many times we've tried to review the property on 14 Mile. There just needs to be some official, execution of that process, and not all of that burden falling on one or two people that may not even be in a really good position to do that. So nothing being motioned today. I just, as a courtesy, wanted to say those topics may be coming up in the next meeting. And that's all, Mr. Chair. Thank you.
Could I ask you a couple, could I ask a couple points on his?
One second.
Okay.
I had the same notes on my notepad in front of me I want to speak about tonight. The public notification is a problem that I've been seeing for quite a while. I understand, I was told that the neighbors didn't have to be notified because it was not a major, what was it called, a substantial change. I think that's incorrect. I think if I'm living next door to the place, I'd like to know. I think that ordinance, if that's what the ordinance says, is that they don't have to be told that a building's going into their backyard, I think we should change the ordinance.
Here. Yes.
I think that should be updated. That is a problem. The other part of not notification of people, like the two people said tonight, they had a hard time finding the city page, finding the thing, and then looking at the ordinances. I think we're not as transparent as we should be on that. I know August is supposed to be working on that for council. He was supposed to find out if we make it any easier, because we got a lot of senior citizens in town, myself included. We adapt to this thing, but it's not as easy. I think it could be formatted easier than it is. It used to be you just go to City of Clausen and boom, everything was there. To me, it's a little bit scattered out. And as far as the temporary TCO, that's been a thorn in my side for quite a while. I see DD's is still on the list for a temporary CFO. Ongoing review of the TCO with administration. Administration can't tell us anything. I asked our city attorney, he says talk to the city manager. City manager doesn't want to talk. Something's going on as far as I'm concerned. I'm not against, trust me, I'm not against this lady running a business. I think it's a fine business and everything else, just that she's not conforming to the ordinances, and I would like to have her come in here and address that. There's a TCO for, it looks like biscuits and gravy. I'm not sure what's, see, in the day, we would issue that ourselves and we would know what the outstanding problems are. I'm assuming as I walk past it now, their air conditioning units aren't screened, so I'm assuming that's a holdback for their, that's why they have a temporary, they don't have a full. But I don't remember the list of items that we gave them on the way out the door. Another problem is it's to me, it's administration enforcement. When we give somebody a site plan approval and they walk out that door, very rarely do we see them again. We hope, we keep our fingers crossed that administration deals with that. We pass sign ordinances like we just discussed tonight, but most of them were building signs. We pass sign ordinances, remember about putting signs on your grass, stick them in the ground, political signs, everything else. We've got a ton of those around town. The ordinance says that they don't belong there, but it's not being enforced. So I don't know where to go with that one. And then I'll let you join in if you'd like.
Oh, yeah, well, I just had a question. I do agree with both of you on the allowing mailing or just alerting.
Make people
Yeah,
aware.
yeah. I do know that, it is zoned for multifamily. I'm not sure how many people look at the zoning of their homes when they're purchasing them. I don't think, based on the last 3 years I've been on planning, that most people do. They even know what we do here, right? So I didn't know if you, just something to think about, you don't have to answer now, but are you speaking to if a use outside of residential is next to a residential home, an existing residential home outside of what it's zoned? Or I would just want to know more about how you're gonna kind of have that work, because the neighbors that all were here that time were backyard neighbors. These guys were side neighbors, but the backyard neighbors, I don't know if they, that would even apply, because they're in a different zone. You know what I mean? Does that make sense?
I don't know how they were made aware of it, that somebody in the neighborhood figured it out and started spreading word.
Well,
around
yeah, and
it.
I'm glad that's.
But they didn't find out from the city about that, and that's where my point of view is. I think the city owes it to residents to let them know, hey, this is coming.
Right, so you think that, like if we do a special use, we mail the neighbors
Yes.
within a radius?
Yeah.
If it's a different use than already existing, or I'm just curious, and you don't have to answer now, but I'm just curious how we might word that. If it's a residential and it's changing uses per our plan or not, we have to mail them, but just something to think about. But I do agree with you guys, and I'd fully support that. That's all. That's my only question.
Anybody else on other business? Okay, then we'll move on to the planner's report.
I'm done for the night.
You're done planning, eh?
Thank you so much, Joe. We didn't get a chance to thank you, but that was a wonderful review. Thank you.
Staff report and training opportunities.
Good evening, guys. I know we're kind of getting close to that 10 o'clock deadline, so hopefully we can get through this quickly, but I do wanted to address a couple comments about what you guys just spoke about. And so when it comes to the TCOs, once we did have the issue, and this is the only thing I'll touch on, DDs, is that issue popped up, is we did change the internal TCO process, and since then we haven't had any issues. And so when it comes to 331 North Main Street, Biscuits and Gravy right next door, when they requested their TCO, there was a quick turnaround time. And so having the ability to do it internally with administration leaves more room to get that done instead of having to wait for a planning commission meeting. And it sounds like you guys want to discuss that again soon, so we'll invite our attorney here to talk about that again in some more detail. But that's just one of the benefits I've seen in my couple of months. So
And what limits us on that is we gave them site plan approval with stipulations attached to it. They build their building up, and they still haven't quite completed it, but you give them temporary, that's to open. Do we ever find out, does this group ever find out that they were completely signed off on, that they've done everything? Or we just left in limbo? We just assumed that it was taken care of?
And that's something I can work on including in that staff report, and I think I spoke with a couple of you after the last meeting that I'm working on having it more in-depth to have some more information to touch on those things. So yeah, that specifically to that, I can work on providing some more detail on what they need to be doing.
Thank you.
Yeah, and that TCO is issued for 45 days, by the way, and that's another one of those items I'll be adding in the future, which should definitely help with some understanding for
Is
you
that the
guys.
right reason, by the way? Or I don't know if you're going to go through them, but is it an air conditioning issue or something?
No, I mean, there were a couple of things that they need to address, but nothing significant that was going to hold them up from being able to open.
Can I ask a question based on that? I'm sure everybody hates it when I say that. Can I ask a question? What triggers, okay, so like a site plan, I thought that they were good for what, a year? So like, aren't they good for only a year? And then the TCO, when is the line where you actually say, okay, now you got to go back in front of planning? Or it's never? Once they get a TCO, they never come back in front of us?
Unless
Or-
they want to have changes to their site plan, which they don't. There's just certain things that they haven't met in their site plan,
But how many years do you give them to comply before that expires? Because I thought that there was an expiration. Am I wrong on that?
My understanding is they have a year to either complete or continue work on a site plan. The temporary CFO, it's a completely separate thing, that they've already got their property pretty close to being done, and they're just asking to get into the doors earlier.
But,
So,
okay,
It's kind of a
so,
different game.
yeah, but it's based off the site plan, right? So it wouldn't, there's not a trigger to like say, okay, your site plan was this, your TCO was this date, and it's been 2 years. You gotta kind of start fresh here. There's
well,
not.
the site plan and occupancy are two different things. So the occupancy
Right.
allows them to operate their business out of their building because it's up to code where it's safe for residents, staff, and the business to operate. The site plan is something that Mr. Kucera was correct on. It's for a year, and then if they're working on it, I mean, there's been a lot of supply chain issues over the last couple of years, so there's been some leniency when it comes to that. And so they're two kind of separate items.
Okay.
Church of Clausen, for example, they've been in there for 7, 8 years, I think, easily.
Yeah.
And never had a site plan until we got to them, and then the site plan they have, I think it's good for about a year, but they're doing work on it, they're progressing. But that's, I don't want to drop things by the way that way. I don't, if you're coming for a site plan, I would think that within a year's time, you could either complete it or you could show in good faith that you're doing something. You know, that's,
Well, and am I misunderstanding, like, so we saw the site plan for the chicken, the biscuits and gravy, sorry, the chicken. They were able to open up shop based on the site plan and get a temporary certificate of occupancy because they fulfilled most things on the site plan. They kind of met the review process. But there's still a couple things that they're not meeting on the site plan, which is why we haven't given them full.
yeah, they would have been issued a
Right.
permanent one. Yeah.
And the building official and it was the day before they opened officially, and we went through the entire site with them, went through what they had to do, and they're going to be getting another contractor, and that's another issue that.
Yeah, no, I'm not worried about, I'm just trying to understand.
Well, I'm just trying to give you some more background.
Yeah, yeah, and I'm not, but I'm just wondering, it's based off of the site plan, so I understand they're two different things, but they're not meeting the site plan that was originally passed,
They haven't
correct?
completed it, no.
Right.
Right, but not having a bike rack out front of your business shouldn't preclude you from opening.
There's no
Oh, of
disagreement on
course.
that, yeah.
Right, I know, but that was
I'm
an
not
example
saying
of
that at all,
one thing
Nick.
that they didn't have. Their ADA parking signs were not technically up to code. I mean, they were.
I'm not,
they were
I'm
there.
talking about this one here, Dee Dee's. How many years has it been since her site plan was in front of us?
She's never been in front of us.
Well, the
Tri-
original.
Tribal Fair was in front of us, and they only completed phase one of the two-phase plan. They sold the business, and Dee Dee's has never come in for a.
She got
completion.
grandfathered into the site plan essentially, in its
I'm not sure how you can get
TCO.
grandfathered into a site plan.
I don't think it's
Site
legal
plan
at
is.
all, yeah. I don't think it's legal at all.
What has to be done to the building to run a business out of it. So if you're applying for a site plan, we say you have to have 2.5 handicap spots, and it has to be painted on there, and it has to be handicap accessible. I don't think that goes away if you sell the business to somebody else. I think the next person coming in still has to comply to that. And as far as I know, she's never fallen into compliance.
Well, it's odd. You established a good reason, perhaps, why it is the way it is, and that's it can meet every day of the week and be faster. I accept that. That's a very valid explanation. But it's strange and foreign to me that a variance to a prearranged agreement is approved by someone other than the people who approved it. It's almost like you should just be approving the site plans if you're going to be the ones that are approving the exceptions. But normally that is not, power is not collaborated on this or concentrated into the same entity. So it's nothing against your judgment. This is critical that you understand. It's not a lack of trust in the administration at all. It's just as a matter of protocol, as a matter of business, it's weird that the entity that's approving variances or exceptions is different than the entity that approved it in the first place. Normally, if there's an exception to be granted, it's by the person who approved it in the first place.
And I do think you guys have to take it from two different perspectives. So the example over on 14 Mile, and then the issues with them, and then the new policy we have in place. And then since that new policy has been in place that Joe, Joan, and Rennis worked on, there haven't been any issues because we took steps to make sure it won't happen again. And I think something you guys are looking for is just more background on why TCO is issued, what this business needs to accomplish in this deadline. And I do think by providing that to you guys, they'll get in compliance probably easier. So yes.
Well, as you noticed, when Joan puts out her monthly little thing about the city of Clawson, last month she said that was approved, the apartment complex that came in front of us. That never came in front of us, but it's printed in her news flyer that it was approved.
I can't comment on that.
I know,
It wasn't approved, so
there's
I don't know where that came from.
wrong news out there. So I'm just trying to make it easier for the residents to see what's going on there and keep up to speed with it. You know?
Right. And I know our website isn't necessarily the easiest to follow, but I mean, I've spent time on other municipalities' websites, and ours definitely fits in the easier to follow category. There are multiple ways to get to view our agendas and packets, and I think once you do it once or twice, it's pretty fluid and routine. And I think that's something I've talked to Gene about, to have some type of seminars, work sessions with our seniors down at Hunter. It's just something we're probably going to be looking at after the budget gets approved.
Right. Okay. There you
If I can just continue
Sure.
very briefly, I hope that you've all been able to get into Citizen Planner. If not, please either shoot me an email, let me know, and we'll get you in contact with the right people to make sure you have access to that. When it comes to the next meetings with site plans, we are looking to have 650 North Rochester in front of you guys May 9th, pending all the reviews, which they did get a variance for in March from the ZBA. And so we're also hoping to have for the other 436 through 456 West 14 Mile site plan in front of you guys, but that one might be a little bit more up in the air. It sounded like the engineer potentially had a scheduling conflict, so we definitely want to have him there if you guys are reviewing their site plan again. So that one might be that second meeting in May. So there's a little rough schedule for you guys for next month.
Mm-hmm.
I'd be happy to answer any questions you guys have.
I think we're good. Thank you.
Thanks, Nick.
Thank you.
Nick.
Number 11, legal update. We have no city attorney, so we have no legal update. If anyone has any more final comments to make, aside from adjournment? Everybody's happy?
Mr. Chair, I make a motion to adjourn the meeting.
Second.
Motion support. Roll call, please.
Mr. Colbert,
Yes.
Mr. Kucera,
Yes.
Ms. Redmond,
Yes.
Mr. Scott,
Yes.
Mr. Solomon,
Yes.
Mr. Harrow.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Were those kids from Clausen?
I have no idea.
Oh, really?
Right?
But if their teacher reaches out to me, I'm failing them for not being here the entire time.
Taking a selfie.
Well, it's so funny. I looked up in the Zoom and the guy's face was in the Zoom when he was taking the selfie, so I'll have to like frame that.
Every kid had a phone in his hand.
I think they took a picture for the
I've seen them do
teacher.
that to council meetings. When they come to
Prove they
council
were here.
meetings,